He was supposed to say goodbye and walk away. Instead, he stayed. Long after the final salute faded into the gray morning sky, long after the last police cruiser pulled away from the cemetery, the German Shepherd remained beside the coffin. And before anyone understood why, an entire department would be forced to question whether loyalty can hear things that grief cannot. Rain drifted softly across the rolling hills outside Pine Creek Memorial Cemetery. The clouds hung low, turning the afternoon light into a pale silver glow that washed across rows of headstones. Officer Nathan Brooks rested beneath an American flag carefully folded over a polished oak coffin. He had served the town for nearly 20 years. To some, he was a respected police officer. To others, a mentor, a friend, a neighbor. But to one soul standing only a few feet away, he had been something more. Shadow sat motionless beside the coffin. The 7-year-old German Shepherd had worked alongside Nathan for almost his entire life. Through long patrol shifts, difficult searches, winter storms, and quiet nights on empty roads, they had been partners. Not just handler and canine. Partners. The dog's sable coat was damp from the rain. Water clung to his fur, yet he did not move. His amber eyes remained fixed on the wooden coffin as though waiting for a familiar voice to speak his name. Officers gathered nearby exchanged uneasy glances. Sergeant Daniel Pierce crouched beside him and gently touched the dog's shoulder. "Come on, buddy," he said softly. "Let's go home." Shadow did not react, not even a flick of his ears. The cemetery had nearly emptied now. Family members had left. Friends had returned to their cars. The minister packed away his notes. Yet the dog remained exactly where he was. Daniel tried again. This time he offered Shadow a treat from his pocket. Normally the German Shepherd would have accepted it immediately. Today he ignored it completely. A chill settled over Daniel that had nothing to do with the weather. The dog was not acting like himself. Across the cemetery, the wind stirred through old maple trees. Leaves rustled softly. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed across the valley. The sound seemed impossibly far away. Shadow slowly lowered his head until it rested against the side of the coffin. The gesture was so gentle that several officers looked away, unable to hide their emotions. Nathan's younger sister wiped tears from her face. "He still thinks Nathan is here," she whispered. Nobody answered. Maybe because nobody knew what to say. The hours passed. Rain continued falling. Workers eventually approached to prepare the area for the evening. Yet every attempt to move Shadow failed. He would stand briefly, only to return to the exact same position. Watching, waiting, refusing to leave. As daylight faded and shadows stretched across the cemetery grounds, the German Shepherd finally did something that made every officer present stop in their tracks. He stood, walked slowly around the coffin, and pressed his nose against one specific corner. Then he pawed at the wood once. Softly, deliberately, as if he were trying to point something out. And when he repeated the exact same action a second time, Sergeant Pierce felt the first unsettling question form in his mind. What was Shadow trying to tell them? The cemetery closed at sunset, but Shadow refused to leave. The rain had stopped sometime after dusk, leaving the air cool and heavy with the scent of wet grass and fresh earth. A blanket of fog slowly drifted across the hills beyond Pine Creek. The last workers locked the gates and departed. One by one, the patrol vehicles disappeared down the narrow road. Yet beneath the glow of a distant security light, the German Shepherd remained beside the coffin. Sergeant Daniel Pierce stayed behind longer than anyone else. He sat quietly beneath a nearby shelter, watching the dog through the gathering darkness. Shadow had always been disciplined. Nathan Brooks had trained him with patience and consistency. The dog followed commands with almost perfect precision. But now it was as if every command had lost meaning. The only thing that mattered was staying close. Around 9 o'clock, Daniel approached again carrying a bowl of water and fresh food. He placed both beside the dog. Shadow briefly lifted his head. His amber eyes reflected the pale light. For a moment Daniel thought he might finally eat. Instead, the German Shepherd stood, walked directly to the same corner of the coffin, and gently touched it with his nose. Then he sat down again, watching, waiting. Daniel frowned. Earlier that afternoon, he had noticed the same behavior. Once could be grief. Twice could be coincidence. But now the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. The dog was focused on one exact location. Not the entire coffin. One specific corner. Daniel crouched beside it, and ran his fingers along the polished wood. Nothing seemed unusual. The surface was smooth. The brass fittings appeared secure. Everything looked exactly as it should. Yet Shadow continued staring at that spot with quiet intensity. The church bell in town struck 10 times. The sound rolled across the valley like distant waves. Daniel finally stood and rubbed the back of his neck. Exhaustion weighed heavily on him. The past week had been difficult for the entire department. Nathan's passing had left an emptiness no one knew how to fill. He had been more than an officer. He had been the kind of man who remembered birthdays, checked on retired neighbors, and never left a partner behind. Especially not a four-legged one. Daniel looked back at Shadow. The dog had not moved. The fog thickened as midnight approached. Frost began forming on the grass. Still Shadow remained beside the coffin. Around 1 in the morning, the security camera mounted near the cemetery entrance captured something strange. The footage would not be reviewed until later, but it recorded every detail. Shadow rose from his position. He slowly circled the coffin once, then twice. Then he stopped at the same corner and began pawing gently against the wood. Not frantically, not aggressively, deliberately. 3 slow scratches. He paused, then repeated the exact same action. Again and again. The behavior continued for nearly 20 minutes. As if the dog were trying to send a message no one could understand. Far above the cemetery, clouds drifted apart, revealing a scattering of stars. The world remained silent. But somewhere inside the darkness, a mystery had already begun unfolding. And by morning, that mystery would force the entire police department to take a second look at the place Shadow refused to leave. The following morning arrived cold and gray. A thin layer of frost covered the cemetery grounds, sparkling faintly beneath the early sunlight. Sergeant Daniel Pierce sat at his desk inside the Pine Creek Police Department, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sleep had barely touched him. Images of the previous day kept returning. Nathan's funeral. Shadow refusing to leave. The strange scratching at the same corner of the coffin. He told himself it was grief. It had to be grief. Yet something continued bothering him. Around 8 o'clock, Officer Melissa Grant entered the briefing room carrying a tablet. Her expression immediately caught Daniel's attention. "You need to see this," she said quietly. Daniel followed her into the security office. The room smelled faintly of electronics and old paper. Melissa connected the tablet to a monitor and pulled up footage from the cemetery cameras. Grainy black and white images appeared on the screen. The timestamp showed 1:12 in the morning. There was Shadow beside the coffin, alone beneath the dim security lights. Daniel watched as the German shepherd slowly circled the coffin. Once, twice. Then the dog stopped at the same corner. The exact same corner. Shadow lowered his head and pressed his nose against the wood. A few moments later, he pawed gently against the surface. 3 deliberate scratches. Then he stepped back, waited, returned. 3 more scratches. The behavior repeated with remarkable consistency. The room fell silent. Melissa folded her arms. "Dogs repeat behaviors when they are trying to communicate something," she said. Daniel nodded slowly. He knew that. Every K-9 handler knew that. Training, scent detection, search operations. Repetition carried meaning. Random behavior did not usually look this precise. Another officer leaned closer to the screen. "Maybe there is something inside that corner," he suggested. Daniel almost dismissed the idea immediately. Yet the thought refused to leave him. Nathan Brooks had always been meticulous, organized, careful, the kind of officer who planned 3 steps ahead. If there was anyone capable of leaving behind something no one expected, it would have been Nathan. At 10 o'clock, Daniel drove back to the cemetery. The air remained cold enough to see his breath. A few clouds drifted across the pale sky. Shadow was still there. 24 hours had passed since the funeral, and the German shepherd remained beside the coffin. The moment Daniel approached, the dog stood and walked directly to the same corner. Again, no hesitation, no confusion, the exact same spot. Daniel knelt beside the polished oak surface and studied it carefully. His fingers traced along the edge. Brass hardware gleamed softly in the morning light. Nothing appeared unusual. Then something caught his eye. Near the lower trim, partially hidden beneath decorative molding, was a tiny imperfection, barely visible, too small for most people to notice. Daniel leaned closer. The mark looked almost deliberate. Not damage, not wear, more like a carefully placed notch. Behind him, Shadow released a soft whine. Daniel felt a chill move through him. For the first time, he stopped wondering whether the dog was grieving, and started wondering whether the dog was guarding a secret. Daniel could not stop thinking about the notch. It was small enough to escape notice during a normal inspection, hidden beneath the decorative trim along the lower corner of the coffin. Yet now that he had seen it, he could not ignore it. The cold afternoon air drifted through the cemetery as he carefully ran his fingers across the polished wood. Shadow stood only inches away, watching every movement with unwavering attention. The German shepherd's ears remained forward. His eyes followed Daniel's hand. Then, as if confirming he was finally looking in the right place, the dog softly touched the corner with his nose once again. Daniel felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "All right, buddy," he whispered. "What did Nathan leave behind?" Within an hour, Daniel had secured permission from Nathan's family to perform a closer examination. They gathered inside a quiet room at the funeral home where the coffin had originally been prepared. Nathan's sister, Rebecca Brooks, sat quietly near the window. Her eyes were tired from days of grief. Yet even she admitted that Shadow's behavior felt unusual. "Nathan always said that dog understood things people missed," she said softly. The room fell silent. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the late afternoon sky. Inside, the scent of polished wood and old flowers lingered in the air. A funeral director carefully inspected the area Daniel had identified. At first, nothing seemed out of place. Then he paused. His expression changed. "Wait a second," he murmured. He reached beneath the trim and pressed gently against a concealed section. A faint click echoed through the room. Everyone froze. Daniel felt his pulse jump. Hidden beneath the decorative molding was a narrow compartment no larger than a paperback book. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The compartment had been crafted so carefully that it blended seamlessly into the coffin's design. Without the notch and Shadow's persistence, it might never have been discovered. Inside rested a single sealed envelope. Nothing else. No documents. No valuables. Just an envelope. Written across the front in neat handwriting were 3 simple words. "For Shadow." Rebecca covered her mouth. Tears instantly filled her eyes. Daniel stared at the envelope in disbelief. Every officer in the room knew Nathan Brooks had planned everything carefully, but none of them expected this. The German shepherd immediately stood and stepped closer. His tail moved once. Slowly, the first sign of emotion beyond grief that anyone had seen since the funeral. Daniel knelt beside him. "You knew it was here," he whispered. Shadow's gaze remained fixed on the envelope. The room felt impossibly still. Evening sunlight slipped through the window, casting a warm golden glow across the wooden floor. Outside, the world continued moving forward. Cars passed. Church bells rang in the distance. Yet inside that room, time seemed suspended. Nathan Brooks had left behind one final message, and somehow his oldest partner had known exactly where to find it. But as Daniel carefully lifted the envelope from the hidden compartment, he noticed something else tucked beneath it. Something small, something metallic. And suddenly he realized the mystery was far from over. Daniel carefully lifted the envelope while every person in the room watched in complete silence. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, as though it had been prepared weeks earlier and stored with care. Beneath it rested the small metallic object he had noticed moments before. He reached into the hidden compartment and removed it. A soft gasp escaped from Rebecca. It was an old key attached to a worn leather tag. Faded handwriting could barely be seen across the surface. Shadow immediately stood and stepped closer. His tail moved again, slow and steady. Not excitement. Recognition. Daniel stared at the key. Something about it felt deeply personal. Nathan Brooks had never been a man who left things to chance. If he had hidden both an envelope and a key, there was a reason. The room remained quiet as Daniel turned the envelope over. The seal was unbroken. Across the front, written in Nathan's familiar handwriting, were still those 3 simple words. "For Shadow." Rebecca wiped her eyes and nodded. "Open it," she whispered. Daniel carefully broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. The sound of paper moving seemed unusually loud in the silence. For a moment, he simply stared at the first line. Then he began reading aloud. Nathan's words filled the room with a presence that felt almost real. The letter was not addressed to fellow officers. It was not addressed to family. It was written entirely to his partner. Nathan thanked Shadow for every mile they had walked together. Every cold night patrol. Every lost child they had helped find. Every frightened person they had comforted. Every moment of loyalty that never appeared in reports or newspaper stories. As Daniel continued reading, tears appeared in more than one pair of eyes. Even veteran officers who had spent decades hiding emotion found themselves looking down at the floor. The words were simple, honest, human. Nathan described Shadow not as a dog, but as a friend who had stood beside him during the hardest years of his life. Then Daniel reached a passage that caused him to stop. His voice caught in his throat. Nathan wrote that if Shadow was reading this letter, it meant his partner had done exactly what he knew he would do. He had stayed. He had refused to leave. He had found the hidden compartment. Daniel slowly lowered the paper and stared at the words. The room became completely still. Nathan had anticipated everything. Every detail. Every action. It was as though he had known Shadow would somehow understand. Daniel continued reading. Near the bottom of the letter, Nathan mentioned the key. It opened a place that mattered more to him than anyone realized. A place filled with memories. A place he wanted Shadow to visit one final time. Rebecca pressed a trembling hand against her mouth. She knew immediately what Nathan meant. Daniel looked from the letter to the key, then to Shadow. The German shepherd sat quietly beside him, eyes fixed on the paper. Outside the funeral home window, evening sunlight painted the sky in shades of gold and amber. And for the first time since Nathan's funeral, Daniel understood that the hidden compartment was not the end of the mystery. It was only the beginning. The next morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. Low clouds drifted over Pine Creek as Daniel drove along a winding two-lane road leading away from town. Beside him sat Shadow, unusually alert for a dog that had barely rested in days. The old key rested on the passenger seat between them. Rebecca had confirmed what Nathan meant in the letter. There was only one place the key could belong to. A small lakeside cabin nearly 20 miles outside town. Nathan rarely spoke about it. Most people in the department had never even seen it. But Shadow had. Many times. As the patrol truck turned onto a gravel road lined with towering pines, the German shepherd suddenly sat straighter. His ears lifted. His nose pressed lightly against the window. Daniel noticed immediately. The dog recognized the route. A faint smile touched Daniel's face for the first time in days. "You know where we are going, don't you?" he asked softly. Shadow's tail moved once against the seat. The cabin appeared nearly half an hour later beside a quiet lake surrounded by evergreen trees. Morning mist floated above the water. The surface reflected the gray sky like polished glass. Everything felt still, peaceful, untouched by the noise of the world. Daniel parked and stepped out. Cold air filled his lungs. The scent of pine and fresh water drifted through the clearing. For several moments, neither man nor dog moved. Then Shadow trotted toward the cabin porch with surprising confidence. It was not the behavior of a dog entering unfamiliar territory. It was the behavior of someone returning home. The wooden structure showed signs of age, but it had been well cared for. A rocking chair sat near the front door. Wind chimes stirred gently in the breeze. Daniel approached the lock and inserted the key. The mechanism clicked smoothly. Nathan had clearly maintained the place until recently. The door opened slowly. Sunlight filtered through dusty windows, illuminating a room frozen in time. Photographs lined the walls. Fishing gear rested neatly in one corner. A stone fireplace stood opposite an old leather couch. Shadow entered first. His pace slowed immediately. He began moving through the room with quiet purpose, stopping occasionally to sniff familiar objects. Daniel followed behind. Everywhere he looked, he found traces of Nathan. A coffee mug on a shelf. A folded blanket near the fireplace. Framed photographs of mountain hikes and training exercises. Many included Shadow. Years of memories surrounded them. Then Daniel noticed something unusual. On the far wall hung a photograph of Nathan and a young girl standing beside the lake. She looked about 12 years old. Both were smiling. Shadow sat beneath the photograph and looked up at it. Daniel walked closer. The frame contained a folded piece of paper tucked discreetly behind one corner. His pulse quickened. Slowly he removed it. The note was written in Nathan's handwriting. Beneath it rested another envelope. This one carried a different message. Daniel stared at the words for several long seconds while Shadow remained seated beneath the photograph. Outside, wind moved gently across the lake. Inside, the cabin felt filled with Nathan's presence. And as Daniel carefully opened the second envelope, He realized the journey Nathan had planned for his loyal partner was leading somewhere far more important than a hidden cabin. Daniel unfolded the letter carefully while the cabin remained wrapped in silence. Outside, gentle waves touched the shoreline. Wind moved through the pine trees with a soft whisper that sounded almost like distant conversation. Shadow remained seated beneath the photograph, his amber eyes fixed on Daniel as though he already understood what the letter contained. The paper trembled slightly in Daniel's hands. Not because of the cold, because Nathan's presence seemed stronger here than anywhere else. He began reading. The message was addressed to one person, Emily Brooks, Nathan's 12-year-old daughter. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Emily had been living with relatives in another state after her parents' divorce several years earlier. She visited when she could, but distance and schedules had made those visits rare. Nathan never complained about it, yet everyone who knew him understood how deeply he loved his daughter. The letter explained everything. Nathan wrote that if Emily was reading these words, then Shadow had completed the journey exactly as intended. He thanked Daniel for helping his partner find the cabin. He thanked Shadow for refusing to give up. Then came the truth Nathan had hidden from everyone. For months, he had quietly prepared for the future. Not because he expected tragedy, because he understood that life offered no guarantees. Inside a wooden chest beneath the fireplace mantel, Nathan explained, were photographs, journals, recordings, and memories collected over many years. Everything he wanted Emily to know about him. Everything he feared time might otherwise erase. Daniel lowered the letter and stared at the fireplace. The wooden chest sat exactly where Nathan described. Simple, ordinary, easy to overlook. Shadow stood and slowly walked toward it. His movements were calm and purposeful. Daniel followed. When he opened the lid, dozens of carefully organized items rested inside. Family photographs, birthday cards, fishing pictures from summers at the lake, handwritten journals, audio recordings labeled with dates, small keepsakes collected over a lifetime. Daniel realized Nathan had spent years preserving pieces of himself for his daughter. Rebecca, who had arrived shortly after Daniel called her, wiped tears from her eyes as she looked through the collection. Then she discovered another envelope resting on top of everything else. This one carried Emily's name written across the front. The room grew quiet again. Rebecca carefully opened it. As she read, tears slipped down her cheeks. Nathan's words were filled with love, encouragement, and hope. He reminded Emily that distance had never changed how proud he was of her. He told her to chase her dreams, to be kind, to be brave, to trust her heart. And at the end of the letter, he revealed one final request. He wanted Shadow to become part of Emily's life, not as a responsibility, as family. Daniel looked down at the German Shepherd. The dog sat quietly beside the chest, surrounded by memories of the man they both missed. Outside, sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting golden reflections across the lake. For the first time since the funeral, Daniel began to understand what Nathan had truly left behind. It was not a secret. It was not evidence. It was not a mystery. It was a bridge, one built from love, loyalty, and the unwavering belief that even after goodbye, family could still find its way back together. 3 days later, the first snow of the season began falling across Pine Creek. Small white flakes drifted through the air, settling on rooftops, sidewalks, and pine branches throughout town. Life continued moving forward, yet for everyone connected to Nathan Brooks, something important still remained unfinished. Emily had been contacted. Rebecca had spoken with her personally. The journals, photographs, and letters from the cabin had already been shipped to her home. For the first time in years, she was learning things about her father that distance had hidden from her. Stories from his childhood, notes about favorite fishing trips, memories he had carefully preserved so she would never doubt how much she meant to him. But there was one final chapter that could not be mailed inside a box. Shadow. On a cold Saturday morning, Daniel stood outside a modest house in a quiet neighborhood nearly 300 miles away. Snow covered the lawn. A wreath hung on the front door. Beside him sat Shadow in the back seat of the department vehicle. The German Shepherd had been unusually calm during the long drive, almost thoughtful, as if he sensed something important was waiting ahead. Daniel stepped out and opened the rear door. Shadow emerged slowly and surveyed the unfamiliar surroundings. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air. Then the front door opened. A young girl stepped outside. Emily Brooks looked older than the photograph hanging in the cabin. Taller, more mature. Yet the resemblance to Nathan was impossible to miss. The same eyes, the same gentle smile. For a moment nobody moved. Snowflakes drifted between them. Daniel watched quietly. Emily took a cautious step forward. Shadow stood still. The world seemed to narrow to that single moment. Then Emily spoke. "Hi, Shadow." The German shepherd's ears lifted immediately. Something changed in his expression. A familiar scent. A familiar voice. A familiar piece of someone he had loved and trusted for years. Emily knelt in the snow. Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Dad talked about you all the time," she whispered. Shadow took several slow steps toward her. Daniel held his breath. The dog stopped only inches away and studied her face. Then, without hesitation, he gently pressed his head against her shoulder. Emily wrapped both arms around his neck and began to cry. Not from sadness alone. From recognition. From connection. From finally understanding that a part of her father still remained beside her. Daniel quietly looked away, giving them the privacy of the moment. Snow continued falling around them. The neighborhood remained peaceful. Warm light glowed from nearby windows. When Daniel looked back several minutes later, Emily was sitting on the front steps with Shadow beside her. One hand rested against his fur while she read a page from one of Nathan's journals. The German shepherd remained close, calm, and content. For the first time since the funeral, the weight he carried seemed lighter. And as Daniel watched them together, he realized Nathan's final plan had worked exactly as intended. A father had found a way to bring two hearts together, even after he was gone. Winter settled fully over the town in the weeks that followed. Snow covered rooftops in soft white layers, and each evening warm lights glowed from windows as families gathered indoors against the cold. Life continued moving forward, just as it always did. Yet some stories leave quiet footprints that remain long after the final chapter appears finished. Shadow now lived with Emily. The adjustment had not happened overnight. During the first few days, the German shepherd often sat beside the front door each evening, watching silently as darkness settled outside. Sometimes he would lift his head at the sound of a passing truck. Sometimes he would stare at the horizon beyond the backyard fence. Emily understood. She never tried to rush him. Instead, she sat beside him with one of Nathan's journals resting in her lap. Together, they spent long evenings learning about the same man from different perspectives. Emily discovered stories she had never heard. Shadow listened to a familiar voice preserved on old recordings found in the cabin. Slowly, without either of them realizing it, healing began. One snowy afternoon shortly before Christmas, Emily opened a small wooden box that had belonged to her father. Inside, she found a photograph she had somehow missed. It showed Nathan sitting beside a younger Shadow near the lake. On the back, written in careful handwriting, was a single sentence. "Family is not measured by time. It is measured by love." Emily sat quietly for a long moment. Then she looked toward the living room. Shadow was asleep near the fireplace, his head resting on a folded blanket. The orange glow of the flames danced across his sable coat. For the first time since arriving, he looked completely at peace. Not waiting, not searching. Home. Snow drifted outside the windows as evening approached. Emily walked across the room and gently placed the photograph beside Nathan's framed picture on the mantel. Then she sat beside Shadow and rested a hand against his shoulder. The German shepherd opened his eyes briefly. His tail moved once against the floor. Nothing more was needed. Across town, Daniel Pierce parked outside the police department after finishing his shift. Through the falling snow, he could see Christmas lights decorating nearby storefronts. He thought about Nathan, about the hidden compartment, the letters, the cabin, the journey that had begun with a dog refusing to leave a coffin. He smiled softly. In 20 years of police work, he had witnessed many things. But he had never seen loyalty guide people toward healing the way Shadow had. Some mysteries reveal secrets. Others reveal truths. This one had revealed both. Later that night, Emily switched off the living room lights and prepared for bed. Before heading upstairs, she paused beside the fireplace. Nathan's photograph stood on the mantel, surrounded by warm light. Shadow slept peacefully beneath it. Outside, church bells echoed faintly through the winter air. Emily looked at the picture and smiled. Not because she had stopped missing her father, because she no longer felt separated from him. The snow continued falling beyond the windows. The fire crackled softly. Shadow remained asleep. And in that quiet house filled with memories, love, and second chances, everything finally felt whole. Some stories do not end with answers. They end with grace.